So we begin with Problems as Path. That's the title of my presentation today. I want to start by saying first, what do I mean by path? Is path in the sense that the Buddha used the term the Eightfold Noble Path. It's not quite identical to the path that the Buddha taught, but it definitely is a path of awareness practice, and it's definitely a life path. And it shares with Buddhist practice the basic principles of developing wise view, wise effort in the way that we relate to life. And I think that each of us has an opportunity to create a path for ourselves in a very personal sense, in the real world, in terms of what we experience in this life and the meanings that we bring to it. So for me, my life path has just sort of organized itself around my process with psychological problems and issues. This has just always been my way of being. I am one of those persons who's always working on themselves or delving into whatever is happening emotionally and investigating it and inquiring into it and seeing what I can learn from it. So I set about to try to describe a path of practicing with problems that is a little bit faithful to my own way of being with my own issues. And I hope that some of it will come across to you. I wanted to give special acknowledgement to the following spiritual teachers and authors who have had the most influence on me and my understanding of the Dharma. I may talk more about some of them as we go along. And this is a copy of my book cover, so I wanted to give myself a little commercial announcement here for my book and say that most of what I was able to articulate that I had learned over decades, I wrote into this book. And I've gotten a lot of nice feedback on the book, but I've also gotten feedback from people that it's dense to read. If your mind doesn't naturally work in an academic way, it could be heavy lifting to read the book. So I had the inspiration that I wanted to make a presentation about my book that was in a more user-friendly form. And that is part of what was my thinking behind making this slideshow. And the other thing is that the general principle of inquiring deeply, or again, what I call self-reflective awareness practice, it could be the slogan, insight begins with bad news. And by this insight begins with bad news, I don't mean that what we should do is paste a happy face on everything that's happening, or the idea that when life gives you lemons that you should make lemonade. But I really do mean literally that when we can turn towards our problems and issues, even though they might be unpleasant in the moment, and often are unpleasant in the moment, there's a great deal that we can learn from that investigation and that inquiry. So that's what inquiring deeply about problems means. It means taking the opportunity of our real life problems and issues and seeing what can we learn from them, and what can we learn by listening to ourselves meditatively in a therapeutic frame, which is one way we could define the word inquiry, to listen to ourselves meditatively. These are several of the questions that I have been inspired by in my work. The first is, why does life constellate itself around problems? I mean, isn't it curious that everybody has problems? That always seemed to me to be a question in need of an answer. And a second question that was a guiding question for me is, how can we best practice with our problems if we accept the assumption that I talked about earlier, that there's a valuable opportunity with problems? How shall we go about doing that practice? And that translates into a third question for those of us who are psychotherapists. What are skillful means in the consulting room? How can we help other people do this? So the overview to the different chapters in the slideshow that I referenced earlier on are the following four. The nature of problems, that's the why, what, and how of problems. Problems as path is a section on inquiring deeply that talks about what inquiry is and what kinds of questions we can ask when we inquire deeply. Then there's a chapter on the relational dimension of problems. And then the last chapter is called Buddhist versus Psychotherapeutic Perspectives, where I'm going to try to make some meaningful comparisons between Buddhism as a practice and inquiring deeply as a psychotherapeutic kind of a practice. You're probably familiar with the metaphor of the lotus, which is used so much in Buddhism. To me, what it implies, first of all, the lotus grows down deep into the mud, and then it makes this beautiful flower. So the metaphor is that there's wisdom in problems and opportunities for growth contained within them. And kind of a corollary to that is the idea that problems always seem to point exactly where we need to look and reveal what we most need to see. If we can cultivate a good process for looking, we can learn a lot from our problems. Or as Thich Nhat Hanh said in the title of his book, no mud, no lotus. I love this quote from Margaret Mead. We are continually faced with great opportunities, which are brilliantly disguised as unsolvable problems. Another quotable quote. The problem is not that there are problems. The problem is expecting otherwise and thinking that having problems is a problem. So everybody has problems. And there are a number of existential attitudes that we carry often unconsciously towards our problems. And it's good to try to bring these to light in ourselves and with those that we work with. First of all, many people hold that a problem is an indication of some deficiency or failure that they have. That somehow if they were living life right, if they were the right sort of person or whatever, that they wouldn't be having problems. Or a related idea that problems are somehow a punishment for something that we have done or failed to do. This is God's way or life's way of punishing us. But in a way, the most insidious of the existential attitudes is the idea that there's a happily ever after, which if we work really hard, we could get there. And in that state, life will no longer have any problems. And sorry to break the news to you if you haven't already thought of it, but there is no such happily ever after. This is it. Here we are. We have the problems that we have today. And if we manage our problems with a fair amount of success, the reward is that we get to have new problems later. The really bad outcome in life is when we have the same problems over and over and over and over again. So that's the end of chapter 1. And I want to talk now a little bit about the nature of problems. First of all, I want to say that problems are multidimensional at all different layers and levels, from climate change to poverty to politics to all aspects of human welfare. And I am not going to try to address problems as a general thing. What I am going to try to address are the psychological and emotional issues that we call problems that have fundamentally to do with love, belonging, and self-esteem, or we could say that have to do with attachment and relational issues. And I think a basic idea that I have is that problems arise as part of the design function of the brain and mind. We evolved, human beings evolved a symbolic capacity that gave us the ability to think and talk about problems. We can like mock up a problem in our minds and turn it this way and that way and explore alternative possibilities for their solution. But at the same time, this way that we model problems in cognitive space just creates gazillion imaginary scenarios of what might have been, should have been, could happen in the future, blah, 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 all of which obscures the simple but compelling reality of what is. So a lot of problems actually come about as a result of our way of engaging in problem solving. Sometimes people call it overthinking or whatever, but it has something to do with the way that we problem solve, and also allows us the opportunity to begin to get clear about what the thinking mind has to do with the problems, sustaining the problems that we have. The bottom line, I think the bottom line here is that how we define a problem has everything to do with what we believe that we're going to need to do about it. So it is really important to explore our thinking about what the problem is. One way I like to say it is that problems are the leading edge or horizon of change in our lives. And I like this way of articulating it because it says to us that we're, first of all, it implies to us that we're on a horizon of moving events, and that their problem is a leading edge which can carry us towards something that could be useful. Or in other words, we could say, problems show us where we have shut down, where we need to wake up, and where we need to grow. I think problems are very much analogous to physical pain in the sense that they show us what in the psyche is in need of our attention. And we could call this, and then I'll give you an example, we could call this following the slipstream of our intuitive intelligence. So it's very analogous to what happens when we have a body injury and we need to bring our conscious presence to directly feeling the sense of the injury of the problem in order to be able to know what it is that we should wisely do about it. So I had a very profound teaching around this issue several years ago when I had a problem with my right hip, which appeared, and I was x-rayed and so forth, and I found out I had some bone spurs in my hip, and several doctors told me that it looked like I was going to have a hip replacement sooner, if not later. And I was upset about it and not content to accept that answer. So I went to somebody, a bodywork person who knew all about hips. And what I was able to learn from her is that what I called walking was actually more akin to a form of mobilization like dragging one's leg as a cane. So she showed me that I used my right leg kind of as a cane. I never fully put my weight on it. I put all my weight on my left leg and I dragged my right leg along. Now, this is not something that would have been noticeable to anybody. And actually, in order to be persuaded of this, we had to go to the beach and she had to show me the tracks that I left in the sand from the way that I walked. And I was really, really impressed with that. First of all, re-educating myself in walking allowed my hip to cure. So I've not had to have a hip replacement. I have very good mobility and range of motion in my hip now, even though I do still have some bone spurs. But the concept that I came away with that I think is so exciting is that we can relate to emotional pain in this same way. By feeling into the world of emotional pain, we can find out what the problems are that we have and what the opportunities might be for solving them. So following the slipstream of your interest in an emotional problem carries you towards a deep emotional understanding that helps you be a more intelligent problem solver. So that's one of the basic concepts in inquiring deeply. Second basic point is that problems are organized around a core of painful affect. So this goes to a kind of maybe an intellectual understanding about what a problem is. We have an affect deep within our mind bodies. We don't know how to resolve the affect. And so our neocortex gets involved in trying to think of something to do about it. This is where defenses come from. For example, we might obsess or ruminate about a problem. That's a way of looking for a way out of it. Or we might avoid someone that causes us a problem. It's a way of avoiding the feeling that being with them causes us. So in this way, we can understand that that problems are organized dynamically around, I call them knots, K-N-O-T-S, knots of affective experience, or we could say unprocessed experience, or we could even say non-experienced experience. We've got these feelings, these affects that we're not able to metabolize, and so we engage all of these psychological functions trying to figure out what to do about them. One of my favorite psychoanalysts is D.W. Winnicott, and we don't have time probably today to talk about too much about the self, but Winnicott's idea was that the best way to understand ourselves is to understand in process terms that we are really reliant on what Winnicott called going on being. We need to have a sense of continuity of being, or else we contract into a closed position where we're kind of paralyzed and can't go on. We don't have time today to talk about Winnicott's theory, but the basic idea was that this is what mothers do to their babies. When a baby needs something or is trying to do something that is spontaneous, and the mother intrudes on the baby or impinges on the baby with her own ideas about what the baby should do, it interrupts the baby, interrupts the baby's sense of going on being. And in a sense, it annihilates the experience of self. So when we have problems, when we get upset, this is a good way to think about problems, that we're having a reaction and it's interrupting our being. And of course it's distressing. So reacting interrupts being and annihilates it. I would say the main thing here is an emphasis on the importance of the experience of being. The existential analyst Rollo May years ago, some of you may have heard of him, said that the repression of being was the primary repression of human beings. That was the problem that we have, is that we don't know that we be. We don't know that we are. We've repressed our awareness of when we're actually alive and being and when we're not. So to cut to the chase on that, problems depend on how we relate to them and on how we hold them in mind, and whether we can actually maintain going on being at the same time as we have a problem. The difficulty that we have with problems is that we resist them and struggle against them. Ever see one of these Chinese finger traps? They're little bamboo puzzles that you find them in the United States in Chinatown. You put your fingers inside of there. They go in easily enough. You try to pull them out, they won't come out. The way that the thing is woven together causes the fibers to contract around your fingers, so you're stuck. And the only way you can get out of the Chinese finger trap is by doing the counterintuitive thing. You have to push your fingers into the trap, and then your fingers are freed and you can get them out. Same is true in large measure in life. We have to find a counterintuitive strategy which takes us out of our resistance to what we don't like. I'm going to go back here for 1 second and just say we need to learn how to recognize struggle. Because if we don't recognize when we're resisting or struggling, if we don't bring mindfulness to that, then we won't have the opportunity to recognize through self-reflection what thoughts and feelings that we're having that are contributing to this experience of resistance. And a philosophical point: there is no way out of the swamp except through the alligators. And Kong said you have, I think he called them crocodiles. You have those creatures in Australia.
Yeah, in Australia it's crocodiles.
Crocodiles. Okay, and change the slide. There's no way out of the swamp except through the crocodiles. But of course, we don't want to be in our problems. We want to find our way out of them. So this is part of the counterintuitive counter-resistance. And also, wonderful quote from Albert Einstein: problems reflect our state of consciousness, and you can't solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. So this process, inquiring deeply, that we're going to be looking at together today, is a way of trying to solve a problem by instigating a different level of consciousness that allows us to see it differently. Or we could say it this way: you don't have to think outside the box. You just have to realize that there is no box. So that one always makes me smile. If we could realize that there was no box, we wouldn't feel like we were in a box. But the saying does point us to the possibility that there's some unseen box. And I have a wonderful cartoon that will show you this concept later. So problems depend on the questions that we ask and on how we listen to the answers. One other point about problems in general is that every problem has a life story. I used to do a journaling process that was invented by a Jungian analyst named Ira Progoff, in which he suggested going back through your life and just journaling about some of the problems that you've had. Some of them are problems that you've had again and again and again through a lifetime. Other ones are new problems. But it is sort of interesting to look at the autobiographical trajectory of a life story that you may have that has brought you a lot of problems in your life, and can be nice to know that you don't have the same problem exactly that you had when you were 12. So there is an arc of progress that we have with our problems, even though the problems are often long-standing and repeated and embody certain themes about how our personalities are organized. And the story of a problem can be really quite emblematic. Oftentimes in Buddhist teachings, you hear something to the effect of, now you got to let go of the story. You got to drop the story. Just come into the present moment. But actually, you can't necessarily just drop a story. Sometimes what you have to do is to try to drop into a story in order to understand better what the story is telling us. Now, there's a case that I talked about in my book, which I call a man I call Victor, who had a life story which was an emblematic story in his life. We all have those. Victor's emblematic story was that when he had grown up on a farm and when he was a little boy, that his family used to make fun of him. And the evidence, he thought that they were hostile. And the evidence that he had for this was a memory of being in the backyard at a family barbecue, and the family owned a large chicken, and the chicken was chasing Victor around, and the whole family, as he remembered it, was standing around and laughing at his expense. And this was his whole story about human beings, and they laugh at him, they don't care about him. The most interesting thing happened, which is that a home movie surfaced in Victor's life, and it happened to be a home movie about this emblematic event. So there's the family in the backyard, and there's the chicken. The only thing about this story is that it wasn't the chicken chasing Victor. It was Victor chasing the chicken. And yes, the family was laughing, but they were laughing with Victor at his excitement about running after this chicken. So it was one of those interesting turning moments that we sometimes have when we're working with people, and we discover that something that that we have been believing for a long time just isn't really true. That being the case, I want to say that we are made of stories. So the idea of letting go of stories and living in the present moment is, I think, very impractical, unwise, and unrealistic way to go about being a human being. I suggest wise inquiry, thoughtful inquiry about the stories that you tell, and paying attention to the stories that you tell other people about what's happening, because you live inside those stories. And a little epiphany that I had at one time, which is that the problem is always the problem. This may lose something in the translation, but it came from an insight that I had one day, that if I stopped thinking about this particular situation I was in as a problem, that actually there was nothing problematic about it. What made it into a problem was that I insisted that it was a problem. And I found that this was a generalizable insight that helped me and a lot of other people with certain problems that they have. We'll be coming back to this question a little bit later. How can you get underneath this idea that the problem is a problem? But for right now, perhaps you could just take my word for it. Often the problem is the problem. So we move on to Chapter 2, which is how do we inquire deeply into problems? And there's just a few more slides, and then we're going to have an experiential process for a little change of pace. So the first question that I want to raise is, what is inquiry? The meditative practice of asking questions or inquiry has been used for thousands of years in different cultures to develop wisdom, to inspire awakening, and connect more deeply to the sources of wisdom within. And sometimes it's part of formal practice where we could call it contemplative inquiry, which concerns questions of a very basic nature, like who am I, or what is this? And another famous kind of inquiry practice I've already mentioned is koans. But what the really important part of inquiry is allowing our life to become a question for us, holding the content of our life as a question and living in the question of something, on or off the cushion. So in this way, a question can be like an anchor in awareness practice, like we use the breath or something like that as an anchor in meditative practice. Just returning again and again to the question at hand and bringing creative engagement to the moment of asking the question. In this way, the question amplifies our awareness of our experience and can serve to deepen our understanding of particular issues which are of concern. But I want to emphasize that this kind of asking questions, what I'm talking about here, is not a mental process or an intellectual process. I don't mean just, posing a question like, how much is 2 times 3? Or, what do we do about the politics now? Or whatever. These are questions that we raise as a way of inviting the unfolding of wisdom and compassion. And the idea is that we ask a question. It's like throwing a boomerang out into the universe, and then we wait for the answer to come back. That's like for the boomerang to come back. And that invites the unfolding of wisdom and compassion around whatever it is that we're trying to work with. So a question invites you into an experience of something which you want to investigate more deeply. And it doesn't have to be very highbrow. For example, say you find yourself angry about something and you're not clear what you're angry about. A simple inquiry question might be, what is this about? What made me so angry? If you can answer that question easily, maybe you want to go to a more general question, like, why anger? What is anger? So we can just go with the questions that arise for us. We don't have to be like a professor trying to think, what question shall I ask? The first question that we ask is, what is the question? What question can I ask or should I ask? So we're going to start now looking at depth, in a little bit more depth, at the process I call inquiring deeply. And I just want to repeat again that inquiry doesn't need to be set aside into a process of meditation or guided inquiry in any kind. It's a function of conversation that can be fluidly integrated into any clinical conversation that you have or any personal conversation that you have. What sets it apart is the intention to be alert to the art and practice of asking questions and listening for answers. So one way I like to define inquiring deeply in general is that it is a way of looking deeply into problems in a way that breathes space into them, decodes their hidden meanings, and allows them to resolve. I've used this phrase before, but I just want to unpack it a little bit. I also refer to inquiring deeply as practicing with problems. So this serves to emphasize the fact that inquiring deeply, as I mean it, is actually an awareness practice, or more specifically, it's a self-reflective awareness practice. We use contemplative practice to learn to listen meditatively to ourselves more deeply, to feel more deeply into our experience, and to learn to rest in the nature of the problems and the questions themselves. So another way to say this is that we don't really inquire deeply from our heads. We inquire deeply from our being. Some say from the belly. Hold the question in your belly. But I don't relate really to holding questions in my belly. I feel them more in my heart. But the point is that we hold questions in a sense of embodied being, trying to feel into experience, trying to develop intuitive awareness of what's actually happening. And sometimes I like to say that inquiry is an extended conversation that takes place both within the person and with the external world simultaneously. So another way I express this sometimes is that a question is a chrysalis, which invites answers to slowly develop and emerge. And it's also important to recognize that answers don't come from what we know, but from what we don't know. So when we ask a question, we listen for what calls to us as an answer. Another way to say it is that we inquire deeply by marinating questions in our receptive awareness. There are several aspects of deep inquiry that we've implied so far, but I want to repeat them for emphasis. The first is that when we inquire deeply into something, we need to lean into the experience of it. The spiritual teacher Tara Brach gives an example that I like very much about ducks that live in the Atlantic Ocean. She says, inquiry is like watching a duck in the Atlantic Ocean when there are swells in the ocean, when there's turbulence in the ocean. The duck nestles into the turbulence and rests there. So that's a kind of a neat little visual idea for how we can aspire to lean into experience when something is happening that's uncomfortable for us, that we consider problematic. We've already talked about the felt sense in the guided meditation, so we want to focus into what the body knowing is. And in somatic psychology, we call this the level of knowing of implicit relational knowing. So for those who may not be familiar with this language, memory is organized into explicit episodes or chapters. That's the story that we tell about something. But in addition, there's all the body knowing that went along with that experience. And often that's what surfaces in the form of traumatic experience or other things. So when we're inquiring deeply, we want to try to pay attention to all of these aspects of experience, leaning into the experience, alert to the body knowing or the relational knowing, and to the felt sense of the problem. I love this quote from Gregory Kramer about don't know mind. Gregory says, thinking we know costs us everything we don't know, which is nearly everything. So this is the bias that we have as human beings that causes a lot of trouble, which is that we think that thinking is the way to solve things. And actually thinking, although it's very useful and I don't put it down whatsoever, thinking costs us the experience of not knowing, which is where all genuine new answers come from. This is one of my favorite slides, Trust Emergence, and it's also a slogan that Gregory Kramer introduced as one of the guiding principles in Insight Dialogue. Maybe it'd be helpful if I say what emergence is. And it's really quite simple. It's the felt sense with which an experience arrives in the mind. It's the experience of something arising or showing up or appearing. And what emerges carries with it the sense of everything that we haven't previously known, not as a reference to something that exists apart from me, but as a way of representing an aspect of my first person experience. For example, if I'm meditating or if I'm having a conversation with someone, what I'm going to say next is not something which is known to me prior. It's something which comes into being in the process of having a conversation. And it comes into being through me, and it comes into being as a result of the relationship, the implicit relational knowing that I have with the other person. So it's a two-person thing, this emergence. We find our answers through what gets enacted or what emerges between us. And it's experienced in varying degrees of intensity as something which is vital or alive, as when something creative first appears. I'll tell you a little secret, which is this is the process by which I wrote my book. When I had a question that I needed to answer for the book, I just asked the question, and then I went into my therapy sessions with the intention that I would find an answer to the question that I had. And you know, damned if it doesn't work. It worked every single time. I asked a question. I don't want to imply that it's magic. It's like it's looking for something with the expectation that answers will emerge. Actually invites answers to emerge. And I think for that reason that inquiring deeply leads to clear seeing and wise view. It helps us to discern what is really going on and to look for what it is that we may need to learn. I think that's expressed beautifully in this quote. We don't see things as they are. We actually see them as we are. And I promised myself I was not going to talk politics this afternoon, but there are just abundant opportunities to see the truth of this quotation in what's happening on the American political scene. It's very hard to know, actually, the way that things are, because we cannot see them apart from who we are and our biases. And this is my favorite slide. What we are blind to in ourselves is the limiting boundary of our freedom. So this is my friend, a little bird that I had drawn as the major illustration for my book. This bird expresses so much, I think. He's in a cage. He's holding fast to two bars of the cage, which give him the appearance or the illusion that he's trapped in a bind, can't get out. And he's oblivious to all the space that is around him. And that is really the human condition. That's how we are all the time with things. And what we're blind to in ourselves are these bars that we're holding on to. That's why the last question in the inquiry was, what do you need to let go of? It's like, what are the bars of the cage that hold you prisoner? And for those of you who are interested in this concept, there is a wonderful paper referenced in the list of references you'll get in your PDF document of a paper by the psychoanalyst Bernie Brandshaft, which is called To Free the Spirit from Its Cell. And it has to do with ways that we are imprisoned by our relationships with others. As I said earlier, questions are more important than answers. The next set of slides, I think, are the heart of this presentation. And you can read them through now, and you can use them as like a little library of questions that come in very handy when you are in a clinical situation or a personal situation, which you may be feeling flummoxed about or don't know how to address. These are all great questions. First set of questions. What am I feeling? What triggered it? What wants to be known? What is at stake? You know, the truth is that anything can trigger us. Someone criticizes us, someone looks at us weirdly, and suddenly we're triggered into anger or blame or recrimination or self-doubt. These basic emotional mechanisms that we have are wired in, and the felt sense of reaction is what we call being triggered. It's the center of our psychological disequanimity, or it's actually the core of psychological suffering. It's what the Buddha meant by dukkha, especially rendered more complex by the second arrows by which we judge and evaluate ourselves for our reactions. What am I clinging to? What am I avoiding? What am I resisting? What do I not want to feel? What am I trying to be, do, or have? What story am I believing? Oh, I just want to make a brief comment about this slide. I've already referenced the fact that I think that the idea that is often taught in Buddhist practice, that what we're intended to do is to drop the story of our experience, is an unwise aspiration. That's not to say that it's not sometimes good to drop the story. The story may be misleading, but the stories that we tell contain the meanings that things have for us. And meaning is what human beings are fundamentally about. We are meaning-making animals. So I think stories are should be one of the primary points of focus in Dharma practice or psychotherapy. And some questions that go along with it. What opportunities does this problem contain? What is my intention? What is my heart's longing? This question has been a really good friend to me. What is the most important thing? I learned this question. I guess, was first asked by Suzuki Roshi, who said the most important thing is to know what is the most important thing. And I find that to be just profoundly true. But even without saying that, just asking the question, what is the most important thing, is a very good guidance for ourselves. And Adyashanti wrote a brilliant book called The Most Important Thing, which had a very big influence on my spiritual development, and I recommend it. Again, that will be in the list of references that you'll get in your PDF. I like this question as well. Am I willing to be changed by change? A lot of people will insist upside down and backwards what they really want is to change. And then what we can notice as human beings and as therapists is all the things that people do to avoid changing or to hold on to keeping themselves in the same old state that they've always been in. And I think that this is a game changer, this question, when you start to look at, well, are you really willing to change, or do you just want things to get better without you having to do anything different? So it's a profound question. I love this question also. Who would I be if there were no problem to solve? In addition to the fact that problem solving is one of the basic mechanisms of the human brain and mind, as I said earlier, we tend to ego identify with our problems. And one of the reasons people don't want to let go of their problems is they don't know who they'd be without the problem. Problem gives the meaning, the focus, and the organization to their lives. They don't want to be. I mean, they may on the surface feel that they want to be free of the problem, but they can't wrap their minds around how they would organize their lives without that problem. So we need to begin by looking at what are the functions that problems solve for us. And I like this one too. Ask yourself this question: why should I let anybody tell me what questions to ask myself? You're all here very kindly listening to me tell my idea about the best questions, but I think this is really the best question because it implies something that we need to know, is that we are the only ones that know what questions to ask ourselves, really. So it's fine to take input from other places, but what are your questions? That's a very important question. What really is important to you? And I love this poem. Probably some of you are familiar with it, from Rilke, the German poet. Do not seek for the answers that cannot be given, for your world would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. And perhaps without knowing it, you will live along someday into the answers. I like to refer to inquiring deeply as a process of finding freedom within rather than freedom from problems. So this orients us away from the idea that we have to get past our problems in order to be free, and reorients us to the idea that it's more wise to look for the freedom that is available within the problems that we have. So I'd like to invite you to just take, I'm going to say 3 minutes of silence right now to just turn your attention inward and see which of the questions that you have just seen flash up on the screen are questions that you connected with. Which ones spoke to you? What one or more than one, do you imagine that you could take on as an inquiry practice for yourself, just to see what is inquiry like? What question could you ask yourself? And then you pick the question and then you ask it to yourself every time you think of it during the day. And you do that for a few days or a week. So we're going to move along now to the 4th chapter of the slide presentation, which is called The Relational Dimensions of Problems. I consider myself to be a relational psychoanalyst, and I consider the work that I do to be relational psychotherapy. And trying to explain what all I mean by that goes way beyond the scope of this presentation. But I will say some things about it that I inquire deeply by helping people to focus mindful attention on the relational field. And I'm going to define what I mean by relational field. But that was what happened in the case of Tom that I read you at the beginning of the presentation. By using the query or the probe, alive or dead, I focused his attention indirectly on the relational field between us and on how he was feeling. And a lot of people need a lot of help becoming alert to the relational field that they live in. And we can use awareness practices to amplify our experience of problems and their relational underpinnings. And one of the ways that we do this is by interpersonally inducing a state of mindful awareness just by the way that we are with the person that we're working with. And if you're not a professional therapist, the same logic applies to anybody that you have a relationship with. It has to do with the quality of attention and mindfulness and presence that you bring to your connection with others. I call this inquiring deeply, the relational field as the mirror of the self. I love this little quote from Cocteau. Mirrors should think longer before they reflect. And we should think longer about what is reflected to us back from the people in our environment, in our friendship network, in our families, in our cultures, because they show us a lot about how we function that we may not otherwise recognize. A lot of the suffering that we experience in life is interpersonal or relational. I learned this idea first from Gregory Kramer, the Dharma teacher who invented Insight Dialogue, who has written a wonderful book. And maybe some of you were at his, when he taught the ABCAP weekend some years ago. He has, in his book, unpacked a very good understanding about the fundamental suffering that stems from our interpersonal and relational lives. We could say relational problems are our painful patterns of reactivity with others, what others do and don't do, what others say and don't say. And it can be very illuminating if you are inclined to be at all obsessive compulsive, which I am. Just keep a list, keep a running list for a week of all of the things that happen that make you react, or that stir an emotional reaction in you, or that trigger you. And I think you will find it very humbling how often we get triggered by others. And it only makes sense because we are interpersonal beings. And there's so many ways that we are entangled with other people's motives and other people's patterns and ways of being. And a good part of psychoanalysis has to do with understanding some of the dysfunctional ways that we react with other people, but that is beyond the scope of what we can begin to talk about today. But suffice it to say, we experience painful experiences of disconnection. My patient Tom, whose story I read you in the beginning, that was his whole thing, was how painfully disconnected he felt. We feel upset when we feel insufficiently appreciated and understood, or when we feel unworthy, or when we feel unloved. And this points to the basic relational needs that we have, that we need to have met by other human beings. Those of us who are lucky had those needs met reasonably well when we were young, and those of us who did not carry those unmet needs forward into relational problems with all of the people that we are intimate with in our lives. A big deal has to do with the wish for and fear of being seen. Worth contemplating in yourself. In what ways do you wish to be seen? In what ways are you afraid of being seen? And this also goes to the heart of robust vulnerability, because on the one hand, we want to be seen, and on the other hand, it's painful sometimes to discover how we are seen and to become aware of the rough edges of our being and some of the ways that we are imperfect and are seen to be imperfect. We have emotional problems or suffering around a very entrenched need to compare ourselves and others. In Buddhism, this is called the essential conceits. The conceits of life. When you think about conceited like junior high school means that you think you're better than somebody. But in Buddhism, conceit means simply the conceit that you're better than another, but it's also a conceit that you're less good than another. And it's also a conceit that you're the same as another. In other words, these are the conceits. They cause suffering, and they all have to do with any way that we compare ourselves with other people. This to me is a profound idea. And basically what this says is that when we suffer with a problem, we may have an idea about the content that it attaches to, what we didn't get from another, or the nature of the problem that we have with someone. But if you probe into it, if you delve into it, what you can see is that the problem is causing us in some way to be unable to be fully ourselves in the face of whatever this difficulty is that we're experiencing. And that it's our inability to be fully ourselves that is the problem, far more than what we're getting from the other person. So this to me is a profoundly illuminating understanding about the way that we feel so alone with our problems and how problematic that is. Another basic point is that the wounds that we incur in relationship are best healed in relationship. This is the argument in favor, in my mind, the argument in favor of relational psychotherapy. That's not to say that we can't heal some wounds by sitting on a cushion and investigating our experience and feeling connected to the relational sacred or whatever. But relationship problems are most easily and effectively addressed when we can address them with others, and especially if we can address them with others with whom we have a problem or who have wounded us. And this goes back to the idea, which I hope you learned in your mental health education or somewhere along the way, but relationships with significant others are the primary ways that we have to regulate our emotional equilibrium. So this is what relationships are for, in a certain sense. It's to provide a social connection, which allows us to address our feelings and to stay in some state of equilibrium. So one of the ways that mindfulness practice is really good is that it's a primary way that we can set about to regulate our emotional equilibrium, but it won't take the place of having another who can hear and understand, deeply understand what it is that you're upset about. This is the, to me, very significant importance of being deeply understood. And to me, it is the function of what happens in psychotherapy, although I recognize people do psychotherapy in different ways and not always about understanding, sometimes about changing behavior or seeing, that there's an addiction that needs to be healed or whatever. But when you go down enough layers, you'll find a layer of emotional disequilibrium. And this is what we need to heal in our relationship with others. I call it creating a relational home for problems. Not an original phrase. Got this one from the psychoanalyst Robert Stolorow. But I love this illustration and I love the idea of it. We have to have a place where we can take our bloody knees and get them kissed and bandaged, you know? We need a relational home for our problems. This is one of my favorite slides, and I use it to illustrate the concept of the therapeutic relational field. And I borrowed this phrase, co-mindfulness, from Kong, because I think it describes so beautifully what this idea is. But when we listen meditatively to another person, when we really drop down deep inside ourselves and just receive what it is that they're wanting to say and wanting for us to understand, we drop into states of deep intersubjective resonance and presence with the other person, which are themselves deeply healing. We can call that co-mindfulness. It's like being present together. It invites the emergence of new experiences. I'm going to go back here one second. In the old school way of thinking about human beings, the mind was contained inside one person's head, and the other person had the job of deciphering language to understand what the other person was experiencing. Now we understand that actually relationship is a medium in which two people participate together in states which can be called intersubjective, in states which are resonant, one person with the other, in states which two people are present together and co-create an experience of connection. So we can call that co-mindfulness, and we can say that it invites the emergence of new experience. And another thing that we can, conscious is it anyway? Let's say you have an enactment that happens between two people and one person gets angry. Okay, a common fight. First thing they fight about is who started it. Who's really angry here? I think you're angry, but no, you think I'm angry, and we're fighting about it. Who's right? Who's wrong? On the assumption that the experience arises in one of us and that the other person is a passive receiver of it. But actually, the whole thing gets turned around in our understanding when we recognize that things co-arise between people as a function of each person's contribution. And when we can truly, sincerely, and without blame ask this question, whose unconscious is this anyway? We can understand that in a molecule, which consists of us and another person, all kinds of stuff comes up to be enacted. And it really doesn't make sense to try to say whose experience it is. It's ours. It's our experience. It's our shared vulnerability that arises in the form of unpleasant interactions among us, between us. So for this and many other reasons, I like to define psychotherapy as a series of now moments, or I called it in my book, present moments and moments of presence, meaning that we come together with another person in the present moment, and we try to be present, deeply present when we're with them. And when we can be deeply present with another, that is what is called a now moment. And now moments are healing. Another phrase that I like very much for describing the impact of psychotherapy is the phrase listening another into being. And I could actually talk about this topic for a long time. We don't have the time, but my idea is that, well, this goes back to the psychoanalyst Kohut. Some of you may have heard of Kohut. And Kohut had the idea that when a mother is pregnant with a baby, that the baby, even before birth, has a virtual self that comes into being in relation to the mother's and the father's expectation of who that little being is going to be. And then when the baby is born, there is a set or a bias to respond to those things in the other that we think are of the nature of that person. And by paying attention to those things and being tuned to them, we actually have the effect of listening the other person's self into coming alive within them, encouraging their interests, tuning into their feelings. How we listen to another depends on how that person, who that person becomes. So going back to the little story that I told on myself at the beginning of the webinar, asking my friend and colleague to tell me what did she think, what did she value in me? I was really saying to her, help listen me into being by telling me something about myself that I may not know, that would be really helpful to me to grow into. It's like we grow at the edges of our being and we grow into the listening that is provided by others. It's almost like, I think of it as like watering a plant that you're trying to grow in your garden. When another listens deeply to us in a deeply present, deeply caring and passionate and compassionate way, it makes us grow. We actually listen one another into being. This is some lines from a poem by a man named Rob Foxcroft, whom I like very much, and I gave you the reference for his book in the PDF file that you'll be getting. And this is just an excerpt. He says about meditative listening, when you feel heard, a silence falls. In that silence, more may come. Often it is something deeper. You can feel it just now, forming at the edge of being. So this is the interpersonal magic that happens when we bring co-mindful meditative listening into the consulting room. The psychoanalyst George Atwood says this: to see someone coming to the truth of his or her own life inevitably is to be brought closer to the truth of one's own. So what this means to me is that when one of us heals and grows, the other one of us heals and grows. We learn from the people that we work with. And I actually, in a somewhat mystical way, I guess, believe that we attract into our consulting rooms those who not only we have the ability to help them, but those whose help we also need in what that person will bring out with us and from us. So we have our last section now. We have about 25 minutes left to do two things. First of all, to talk about Buddhist and versus psychotherapeutic perspectives, and also to have some time for discussion. So I'm going to go through these last slides quite quickly. The first point I want to make is that neither Buddhism nor psychotherapy is monolithic, and it's a mistake to think that we're going to come up with a simple one-to-one correspondence between Buddhism and psychotherapy. I think in general, we could refer to the idea of a distinction between growing up and waking up, where growing up has to do with getting in touch with our psychological issues and healing some of our relational wounds. And liberation has to do with the cultivation of awareness, which is in some regard transcendent to ego identity. And I think that the basic questions are who we think we are, who we are afraid we are, and who we are attached to being. Dharma and psychotherapy come together around these questions. I'm very taken with John Wellwood, who wrote the classic book in, I think it was in the 1990s, on the psychology of awakening, said that personality, described personality as a frozen form of our true nature. And the basic idea here is that there is a healthy core of growth inside of personality, which gets off track and begins to cause problems for us. He uses the image of the silkworm binding itself in its own silk, where the silk represents the beautiful, rich resources within. And we draw on these resources to form a personality structure, which initially protects us from the vicissitudes of life, but later winds up kind of incarcerating us. So in this context, we can see that problems are personal obstacles, psychological blocks of ice that we need to melt with awareness and compassion. The basic premise of mindfulness, and I decided not to spend a lot of time in this presentation talking about mindfulness because it gets talked about so much, but the basic idea is that conscious awareness in this moment of now begins to release the hold of unconscious repetitions of old patterns of reactivity and behavior. And this is a great example that Sylvia Boorstein gave that I think just tells the whole thing. So it recently happened to me that a grumpy mood filled my mind, and for some while I thought about it. Why this? Why now? What happened? What does this mean? So she was inquiring deeply about it. Quite soon, she said, I realized that rather than being mindful of the mood, seeing it as a passing phenomenon, I'd engaged in a struggle with it. I laughed. I knew it for the grumpy mood it was, and it disappeared. So this is the brilliant idea that everybody has about mindfulness. It's like a solvent for everything. You know, you just bring mindfulness to it and poof, it goes away, and that's the end of that. But as we all know, that is not the end of that. And I think that this refers to what the Buddha often said is it's not sufficient just to remove the poisonous flowers from the plant. You have to pull the plant up by the roots. Otherwise, the plant flowers again and again with the same poison. So the basic idea here is that problems, I think, recur in repetitive cycles of holding on and letting go. And the good news as we work through our problems is hopefully when things are going well, each time we return to a problem, it's one turn higher on the spiral. So we begin gradually remembering, repeating, and working through the knots in our personalities that keep us so tied to suffering. And this quote doesn't really belong in this talk, but I couldn't leave it out. It's one of my favorite quotes. It's a quote by the analyst Roy Schaefer, who reminds us, the self is a story. It is the story that there is a self to tell a story to. Good one to contemplate. And I also want to make the point that personality doesn't get enlightened. You know, we get enlightened, we're still going to have our personalities, we're still going to have to work with our problems. It isn't that we are practicing so that we will become someone else. I think the key to my understanding of enlightenment anyway is getting to a point where we can be comfortable in our own skin, where we can be authentic and alive and be who we are, not to be some idealized, enlightened version of ourselves. So in conclusion, some lines from one of my favorite poems, Hokusai Says by Roger Keyes. Hokusai says, look carefully. He says, pay attention, notice, He says to keep looking, stay curious. He says there is no end to seeing. So from beginning of life to end of life, we are going to keep discovering. We are going to keep having insights. We are going to keep having problems. And hopefully we are going to deepen in wisdom and compassion in a way that allows us to bring our goodness into the world. I like this quote from the mystical philosopher at the turn of the last century, G.L. Gurdjieff, who said, "The more clearly you can see the situation, feel your way into the situation, articulate what you feel, put words to your experience, the more real it becomes, and the more real you become. The world is only real when I am." So this takes us back to the idea of being. That's our job in life, to become ourselves. And I call this whole talk wise relationship. It was originally a joke, and now I actually take this quite seriously. That wise relationship is the 9th step on the Eightfold Noble Path. All of the other wings of Buddhist practice come together in the ways that we relate with other, not only human beings, but all other sentient beings. And we try to bring awareness of boundaries, awareness of all the aspects of relationship to being wise and compassionate in our relations with others. And the final slide from Winnie the Pooh. Life is a journey to be experienced, not a problem to be solved.